Have you ever wondered what happens when the world refuses to see someone who carries mountains of pain on her skin? When every scar tells a story that nobody wants to hear? When silence becomes the only language of survival? Tonight, I need to share with you something that has haunted me for weeks. A story buried so deep in the forgotten pages of American history that even the dust refused to settle on it. There was a woman. Her name was Minerva, and for 37 years, she moved through the Whitfield plantation in Mississippi like a ghost made of flesh and bone. The overseers walked past her. The house servants pretended she did not exist. Even the other field hands avoided her gaze, as if looking into her eyes might somehow transfer her curse onto them. Her back carried a map of horrors, ridges of scar tissue that crisscrossed like rivers on a tortured landscape. And yet, despite everything they did to erase her, despite every lash that was meant to break her spirit, there came a day when a single man looked at her and spoke 5 words that would echo through generations. 5 words that would ignite a flame nobody could extinguish. If you believe that some stories deserve to be remembered, hit that subscribe button right now, because what I am about to reveal will change how you understand courage, resistance, and the unbreakable nature of the human spirit. Stay with me until the very end, because the final revelation will leave you breathless. The Whitfield plantation no longer exists in the way it once terrorized the living. Where the great house once stood, there is now only a depression in the earth, a wound that Mississippi soil has tried to heal for over a century and a half. Oak trees have reclaimed the land where cotton fields stretch toward the horizon. Spanish moss hangs from their branches like the gray hair of mourning widows. But if you walk that ground on certain evenings, when the humidity rises and the fireflies begin their silent dance, old-timers say you can still hear it. The sound of iron striking iron, the rhythm of chains being tested, the whispered prayers of those who had no God that would answer. In the summer of 1857, this was the kingdom of Colonel Harrison Whitfield, a man whose wealth was measured not in acres or bales, but in human bodies. 347 souls existed under his dominion. 347 people whose lives, whose deaths, whose children, whose memories belonged to him by the law of a nation that had convinced itself that ownership of human flesh was ordained by Providence. The main house rose 3 stories high, its white columns gleaming like the bones of something ancient and predatory. 12,000 square feet of mahogany floors and crystal chandeliers and imported French wallpaper. Every nail driven into that structure had been paid for with blood. Every brick had been laid by hands that would never touch freedom. But this story does not begin in the great house. It begins in the quarter-mile of packed earth that separated the mansion from the slave quarters. It begins in that middle distance where 2 worlds existed in impossible proximity, where the laughter of white children playing on manicured lawns could be heard by mothers who had watched their own children sold away like livestock, where the smell of roasting meats from the kitchen drifted toward cabins, where families survived on cornmeal and the occasional piece of fatback. If you want to follow more cases like this one, stories that shake the foundations of everything we think we know about the past, subscribe to this channel so you never miss a single investigation into the hidden truths of history. In that middle distance, there was a woman who existed in a space between visibility and erasure. Her name had been recorded in the plantation ledger as property. Line 47, acquired 1842, female, approximately 18 years of age, $130. No family name, no origin story, no humanity worth documenting. Just a transaction completed, a body purchased, a tool obtained. But she had a name. She had been given that name by a mother she barely remembered, in a place she could no longer locate on any map of her memory. Minerva, named for the goddess of wisdom and strategic warfare. A name that would prove to be prophecy, wearing the disguise of coincidence. The Whitfield plantation operated on a system perfected over 3 generations of cruelty. Colonel Harrison Whitfield had inherited the land from his father, who had inherited it from his father, who had carved it from the Mississippi wilderness with machetes and the labor of people he considered no more sentient than the mules that pulled his wagons. Each generation had refined the machinery of oppression. Each generation had discovered new efficiencies in the extraction of human suffering. The plantation stretched across 4,000 acres of delta land, rich, black soil that could grow anything if you fed it enough sweat and tears. 2,000 acres dedicated to cotton, 500 to corn, 300 to sugarcane, the rest divided between pasture, timber, and the swampland that bordered the eastern edge like a warning from nature itself. The great house sat at the center of this empire, but the true heart of the operation beat in less elegant structures. The cotton gin occupied a building larger than most churches. Inside, the machinery roared from dawn until well past dark during harvest season. The sound was deafening. Workers emerged with cotton fibers embedded in their lungs, their nostrils, their eyes. Many developed the cough that would eventually kill them, their bodies slowly filling with the white gold that made their master wealthy beyond the dreams of ordinary men. The smokehouse stood near the kitchen, its walls permanently stained with the grease of 1,000 slaughtered hogs. The blacksmith shop rang with the sound of hammer on anvil, producing not just horseshoes and plow blades, but the instruments of control. Chains, shackles, the iron collars that would be locked around the necks of those who attempted escape, the branding irons that marked flesh with the Whitfield W, claiming bodies the way a rancher claims cattle. But the building that cast the longest shadow over the quarters was not the largest. The whipping post stood in a clearing at the exact center of the slave community. A simple structure, just an oak beam, 8 feet tall, driven deep into the Mississippi clay. Iron rings set at various heights to accommodate the bound wrists of the condemned. The wood had been worn smooth by generations of hands gripping in agony. The ground around it never fully absorbed the blood that had soaked into it. Even after the heaviest rains, the earth there remained a slightly different color than the surrounding soil. The daily rhythm of the plantation began before sunrise. A bell would ring from the tower behind the great house, its sound carrying across the flat landscape like the voice of a god demanding worship. Within 15 minutes of that first toll, every able-bodied worker was expected to be in the fields or at their assigned station. Failure to appear brought consequences. The first offense meant reduced rations. The second meant the post. Work continued until the sun disappeared behind the tree line. 14 hours in summer, 12 in winter. The tasks varied by season. Planting season required bending bodies over the furrows, dropping seeds into holes made by wooden pegs. Growing season meant endless cultivation, chopping weeds, carrying water, fighting against the insects and diseases that threatened the crop. Harvest season was the worst. Cotton bolls had to be picked by hand, each fiber separated from its protective shell, the sharp edges slicing into fingers until they bled. The women worked alongside the men in the fields. There was no accommodation for pregnancy, for nursing mothers, for the monthly pains that civilization pretended did not exist. Women gave birth in the cabins and were expected to return to work within days. Their infants were left in the care of those too old or too young for field labor. Many women strapped their babies to their backs and continued picking cotton, the rhythm of their labor becoming the first lullaby their children would know. The hierarchy of the plantation was rigid and ruthlessly enforced. At the top stood Colonel Whitfield himself, a man whose presence on the grounds was relatively rare. He spent much of his time in Natchez, attending to business interests and social obligations. His wife, Caroline, managed the domestic affairs of the great house with a cruelty that compensated for her husband's absence. Below them came the overseers, 4 white men who had been given power over life and death in exchange for annual salaries that would have seemed modest to anyone who did not understand the additional compensation they extracted through violence and sexual predation. The head overseer was a man named Silas Crenshaw. He had come to Mississippi from Tennessee with nothing but the clothes on his back and a reputation for breaking the most resistant spirits. He was not a large man, but he possessed a quality that those who worked under his authority recognized immediately. He enjoyed his work. Not in the way a craftsman enjoys seeing a well-made table or a farmer enjoys a successful harvest. Silas Crenshaw enjoyed causing pain the way some men enjoy whiskey or gambling. It was a vice, an addiction, a hunger that could never be fully satisfied. Crenshaw had his favorites among the enslaved, not favorites in any positive sense. favorites in the way a cat has favorite mice. Individuals whose suffering brought him particular pleasure. Individuals whose resistance provided him with ongoing entertainment. And at the very top of that list, for reasons that would become clear as the years accumulated their evidence, was a woman whose scars told the story of his special attention. Minerva had arrived at Whitfield Plantation in the back of a wagon, chained to 3 other women purchased at the same auction in New Orleans. She was 18 years old, though she looked younger. Her body had not yet hardened into the muscular form that field labor would eventually impose upon it. Her eyes had not yet learned to lower themselves in the presence of white people. That defiance was noticed immediately. Within her first week, she had been taken to the post. Her crime had been speaking without being spoken to. An overseer had asked a question of the woman beside her, and Minerva had answered because she knew the information requested, and the other woman did not. 12 lashes, delivered by Silas Crenshaw himself. Her first scars. The ones that would eventually be layered over by so many others that they became undetectable, absorbed into the larger canvas of her suffering. But something happened during that first whipping that set the pattern for everything that would follow. Minerva did not scream. She did not beg. She did not weep or plead or call out to any god for mercy. She gripped the iron rings and she endured in silence. Her body accepted each stroke. Her jaw remained set. Her eyes, when she was finally released and turned to face her tormentor, held no fear. Only something that Crenshaw could not identify but would spend 15 years trying to extinguish. In the months and years that followed, Minerva discovered her survival strategy. She would become invisible, not in any supernatural sense, but in the practical reality of plantation existence. She learned to move through spaces without being noticed, to complete her tasks with efficiency that attracted no attention, positive or negative, to speak only when speech was absolutely required, to keep her eyes focused on the middle distance, meeting no gazes, inviting no interactions. She developed skills that made her useful without making her valuable. She could cook, but not so well that she would be moved to the kitchen where contact with the white family was constant and scrutiny was intense. She could sew, but kept this ability hidden, except when absolutely necessary. She could read, a skill taught to her in childhood by a previous owner's daughter who had not understood the danger of what she was giving away. This secret she guarded most carefully of all, knowing that its discovery would mean consequences far worse than any whipping. The other enslaved people at Whitfield began to treat her strangely. At first they sought her out. New arrivals, frightened and disoriented, would approach her for guidance. Women who had lost children would come to her cabin seeking comfort. Men planning resistance would ask her opinions on routes and timing. But Minerva gave them nothing. She answered in monosyllables. She offered no advice. She formed no attachments. She had learned, through experiences too painful to revisit, that connection was a weakness that the plantation system was designed to exploit. The community began to regard her as damaged. Not just her body, which bore the evidence of Crenshaw's continued attention, but her spirit. They whispered that she had been broken in ways that could never be repaired, that she had surrendered her humanity in exchange for mere survival, that she was, in the most essential sense, already dead. They stopped approaching her, stopped acknowledging her existence, began to look through her the same way the overseers did, began to treat her as if she were invisible. Minerva accepted this isolation. She cultivated it. It served her purposes in ways that none of them could understand. Because beneath the mask of broken compliance, something else was happening. Something that required the protection of absolute solitude. Something that needed years of patient observation and careful planning to bring to fruition. She was watching. Every day from her position of seeming insignificance, she was gathering information. She knew the rotation schedule of the overseers. She knew which dogs were kept hungry and which were fed. She knew the location of every key to every lock on the property. She knew that Colonel Whitfield kept a pistol in the drawer beside his bed and that it was usually loaded with only 3 rounds. She knew that Silas Crenshaw drank heavily on Saturday nights and could not be roused easily before noon on Sundays. She knew which boards in the great house squeaked and which stairs could be climbed in silence. And she knew the network, the invisible web of communication that connected the enslaved people of Mississippi to each other and to the world beyond. The songs that carried coded messages about roots and safe houses. The preachers who traveled between plantations carrying information alongside their Bibles. The free black men and women who risked their own liberty to pass along news of the coming storm. Minerva knew all of this because she listened, because nobody worried about what an invisible woman might hear. Leave a comment below saying, "Never give up on truth," if you believe that justice must reach all the oppressed. Your words matter more than you know. The years passed with a weight that seemed designed to crush the spirit. Minerva turned 20, then 25, then 30. Her body changed. The girlish softness gave way to the lean strength of a woman who had spent a decade carrying cotton sacks that weighed over 100 pounds. Her face developed lines that told stories she would never speak aloud, and her back became a palimpsest of violence, each new wound written over the healing tissue of the last. Silas Crenshaw's obsession with her did not diminish. If anything, it grew. He had whipped many people in his career as an overseer. Most of them eventually broke. They wept, they begged, they became the creatures he needed them to be. But Minerva remained a puzzle he could not solve. A lock without a key. A fire that burned no matter how much water he threw upon it. Her silence became an insult that he felt personally. Her endurance became a challenge that he could not refuse. The offenses for which she was punished became increasingly absurd. A wrinkle in a sheet. A moment of hesitation in responding to a command. The way she looked at the horizon when she thought no one was watching. Each invented violation brought her to the post. Each session left new marks upon her flesh, and each time she remained silent. She remained unbroken. The other enslaved people watched these proceedings with a mixture of horror and something they were afraid to name. Horror at the violence itself, which seemed to exceed even the brutal norms of plantation life. And something else. Something that might have been hope, if hope were not a dangerous thing to feel in such a place. Because Minerva's continued existence was proof that the system could not destroy everything. That somewhere within the human being, there was a core that even the most determined cruelty could not reach. But the violence was not limited to Minerva alone. The Whitfield plantation was a factory of suffering, and there were many products on its assembly line. In the summer of 1849, a young man named Samuel tried to escape. He made it 7 miles before the dogs caught him. Crenshaw did not merely have him whipped. He had him hamstrung, cutting the tendons behind both knees, crippling him permanently. Samuel spent the remaining years of his life unable to walk, dragging himself between his cabin and whatever tasks he could perform while seated. In 1851, a woman named Ruth was discovered to be pregnant. She had been carrying on a relationship with a man from a neighboring plantation, meeting him in the swamp when the moon was dark. Relationships between enslaved people from different plantations were forbidden because they complicated questions of property ownership. Ruth was sold away. Her partner was whipped so severely that he died 3 days later from infection. The child, if it was ever born, disappeared into the vast machinery of human trafficking that connected the southern states. In 1853, a group of field hands were caught sharing extra food after the harvest. They had hidden a portion of the corn they were supposed to be drying, planning to cook it secretly and supplement the meager rations they received. All 12 of them were whipped. The youngest was 14 years old. The oldest was 63. Neither survived the punishment. Minerva witnessed all of this. She stood in the assembled crowd that was required to watch each punishment, her face as impassive as stone. She cleaned the wounds of those who could still be saved, her hands gentle despite the apparent emptiness behind her eyes. She helped dig the graves for those who could not. And each act of cruelty, each violation of human dignity, each reminder of the system's capacity for evil, was catalogued in a memory that forgot nothing. The transformation was happening inside her, not the transformation that Crenshaw hoped to achieve through his repeated brutality. Something else. Something colder. Something that had moved past rage into a clarity that would have terrified anyone who could see it. The woman who had arrived at Whitfield Plantation as a frightened 18-year-old was gone. In her place was something harder, something more dangerous, something that the plantation system had inadvertently created in its attempt to destroy her. She began to notice things she had not noticed before, the way the other enslaved people moved through their suffering, the small acts of resistance they managed despite the overwhelming power arrayed against them. The mother who sang forbidden songs to her children at night, passing along a heritage that was supposed to have been erased. The old man who carved tiny figurines from scrap wood, giving them faces that looked suspiciously like the overseers, then burning them one by one in his cabin fire. The young woman who could read and write, teaching others in secret sessions held in the swamp where no white person would venture after dark. These people were not broken. They were bending. And Minerva began to understand that there was a difference. That the same system which had made her invisible had also made her a witness to resilience. That the isolation she had cultivated was not just protection, but preparation. That the years of watching and waiting had given her something more valuable than any weapon. They had given her understanding. In the spring of 1854, a child was born in the quarters. Her mother was a young woman named Grace, barely 17 years old, who had been purchased by Colonel Whitfield the previous autumn. The father was Silas Crenshaw. This was not unusual. The sexual exploitation of enslaved women by their overseers and owners was so common that it barely warranted comment. Children of mixed race were everywhere on southern plantations, their existence a constant reminder of the violence that had created them. But something about this particular child captured Crenshaw's attention in a way that nobody had anticipated. Perhaps it was her eyes, which were the same pale gray as his own. Perhaps it was the way she smiled, which reminded him of a sister who had died in childhood. Perhaps it was simply that even monsters are capable of feeling something that resembles affection. Whatever the reason, Crenshaw decided that this child would be different. That she would not be sent to the fields when she reached working age. That she would be educated. That she might even, when she was old enough, be granted her freedom. This created complications that Crenshaw was too blinded by his own sentiment to foresee. Colonel Whitfield had firm ideas about the proper treatment of enslaved people, and those ideas did not include special privileges for the illegitimate offspring of overseers. He tolerated Crenshaw's behavior because Crenshaw was effective at his job, but tolerance had limits. When he discovered that Crenshaw was teaching the child to read, he intervened. The confrontation happened in late autumn of 1856, when the child, now 2.5 years old, was discovered with a primer in her hands. Colonel Whitfield did not discuss the matter with Crenshaw. He simply sold the child. A trader from Alabama took her away on a November morning that was cold enough to see your breath. Grace, the mother, had to be restrained by 3 men to prevent her from throwing herself at the wagon. Her screams echoed across the fields long after the wagon had disappeared around the bend in the road. Crenshaw's reaction was unexpected by everyone except Minerva. The man who had inflicted so much suffering on others became, for a brief moment, acquainted with his own capacity for grief. He drank for 3 days straight. He did not appear at his post. He was found on the morning of the 4th day, unconscious in the hay barn, surrounded by empty bottles and his own vomit. When he recovered, something had changed. The cruelty that had always been calculated, designed to achieve specific effects through specific applications of force, became random, uncontrolled. He began punishing people for no reason at all. Walking through the quarters at night, pulling men and women from their beds, delivering beatings that served no purpose except to transfer his own pain onto bodies less powerful than his own. And Grace, the mother of his lost child, became his primary target. The same woman he had visited in the night with something approaching tenderness was now the recipient of his most sustained violence. He beat her every day. Sometimes multiple times a day. He seemed determined to destroy her entirely, to erase the evidence of his own weakness, to punish her for the crime of having created something he was capable of loving. Minerva watched all of this from her position of invisibility. She watched Grace's body break down under the constant assault. She watched the light die in the young woman's eyes. She watched her stop eating, stop speaking, stop responding to any stimulus from the outside world. And she made a decision. On a cold night in January 1857, Minerva broke 15 years of isolation. She entered Grace's cabin without announcement, carrying a bowl of soup she had stolen from the kitchen scraps. She sat beside the young woman, who lay on her pallet like a corpse that had not yet stopped breathing. And she spoke. "They took my daughter too," Minerva said. The words came out rough, unpracticed, her voice hoarse from years of disuse. "When I was 19. She was 3 months old. They sold her to a man from Georgia. I never found out what happened to her." Grace did not respond, did not seem to register that anyone was present. "I wanted to die," Minerva continued. "For years I wanted to die. I thought about ways to do it, to end everything, to escape the only way they couldn't prevent." Still no response. But Minerva noticed that Grace's breathing had changed, become less shallow, as if something deep inside her was listening. "But then I realized something. If I died, they won. If I gave up, they won. The only way to honor my daughter, the only way to honor all the children they took from all the mothers, was to survive. To remember. To wait." Grace's eyes moved, fixed on Minerva's face. Saw, perhaps for the first time, something beyond the scarred exterior. Wait for what? The words were barely a whisper. The first words Grace had spoken in weeks. Minerva leaned close, so close that her lips almost touched Grace's ear. For the reckoning. The year 1857 brought changes that would eventually reshape the entire nation. The Dred Scott decision came down from the Supreme Court in March, declaring that black people, whether free or enslaved, could never be American citizens and had no rights that white people were bound to respect. The decision was meant to settle the slavery question once and for all. Instead, it poured fuel on a fire that had been burning for decades. On the Whitfield plantation, the news arrived through the network that Minerva had been monitoring for years. It came in fragments, in overheard conversations between the overseers, in the newspapers that lined the kitchen shelves before being burned, in the coded spirituals that carried information along with their melodies, and in the whispered reports of travelers who passed through the region, risking their lives to share what they knew. The response among the enslaved population was complex. Some fell into despair. The highest court in the land had declared them less than human, and there was no higher authority to which they could appeal. Others found a strange comfort in the decision. The pretense was over. The mask had been removed. The true face of America had been revealed, and there was a clarity in that revelation that cut through decades of hypocrisy. Minerva belonged to neither camp. She had never expected justice from American courts. She had never harbored illusions about the nature of the system that held her in bondage. But she recognized the decision for what it was. A trigger. The violence that would eventually consume the nation had been set in motion. The only question was whether she would live to see it, and what she might contribute to its arrival. The network began to crackle with activity. Safe houses along the Underground Railroad were reinforced. Routes were mapped and remapped. Word came from the north of a man named John Brown, who was gathering weapons and recruits for a direct assault on the slave power. Some dismissed him as a fanatic. Others spoke his name with something approaching reverence. Either way, his existence proved that resistance was possible on scales that had previously seemed unimaginable. On the Whitfield plantation, smaller forms of resistance continued. A sugar barrel was discovered to have been contaminated with salt, ruining an entire season's production of preserves for the great house. Tools disappeared from the blacksmith shop with suspicious regularity. Animals sickened and died without explanation. These incidents were never connected to any individual. They seemed to happen by chance, by nature, by the intervention of forces that no investigation could identify. Silas Crenshaw became increasingly paranoid. He saw conspiracy in every coincidence, sabotage in every accident, rebellion in every silent face. His brutality escalated accordingly. The whippings became more frequent, more severe. He began using implements that went beyond even the generous limits permitted by plantation custom. A barbed whip that tore flesh rather than merely breaking it. A paddle studded with nails. A method of suspension that dislocated shoulders while the punishment was administered. And through it all, Minerva remained invisible. She continued her work in the fields, She continued her solitary existence in her cabin. She continued to be dismissed by everyone around her as a broken woman whose spirit had died years before her body would follow. But behind that mask, calculations were being performed. Information was being assembled. Plans were taking shape that would eventually consume the Whitfield plantation in fire. The catalyst arrived in August of 1857 in the form of a new enslaved person. His name was Thomas, and he had been purchased by Colonel Whitfield at an auction in Natchez. He was tall, powerfully built, with the bearing of a man who had not yet been taught to bow. His previous owner had treated him relatively well, by the degraded standards of the institution. He had been a skilled carpenter, valued for his craftsmanship, protected from the worst abuses because of his economic worth. Thomas did not understand what he had been delivered into. He did not know Silas Crenshaw. He did not know the culture of violence that permeated every aspect of life on the Whitfield plantation. When Crenshaw gave him an order that he considered unreasonable, Thomas refused. Not aggressively, not disrespectfully. Simply with the quiet dignity of a man who had not yet learned that dignity was a luxury he could no longer afford. What followed was witnessed by everyone. Crenshaw beat Thomas for 3 hours, not with a whip, with his fists, with his boots, with whatever implements came to hand. By the time he was finished, Thomas was unrecognizable. His face had been destroyed, his ribs were broken. His right arm would never function properly again. He would spend the remaining years of his life as a shadow of the man he had been, his carpenter's skills rendered useless by damage that would never heal. Minerva stood in the crowd that watched. Her face revealed nothing, but her hands, hidden in the folds of her dress, were clenched so tightly that her fingernails drew blood from her own palms. The reckoning she had promised Grace was coming. It was no longer a matter of if, only of when and how. Among those who witnessed Thomas's destruction was a man whose presence on the Whitfield plantation was unusual. His name was Dr. Benjamin Harper, and he was a physician from Philadelphia who had been traveling through the South collecting botanical specimens for a medical research project. A fever had overtaken him in Natchez, and Colonel Whitfield, who had business dealings with Harper's family, had offered the hospitality of his home until the doctor recovered. Harper was not an abolitionist. He was not particularly political at all. He was a man of science, focused on his specimens and his research, largely indifferent to the social controversies that were tearing his country apart. He had seen slavery before. He had accepted it, if not exactly approved of it, as simply the way things were in the southern states. He had never allowed himself to look too closely at its realities. But Thomas's beating changed something in him. He had stumbled upon the scene by accident, having taken a walk to clear his head after a bout of fever-related dizziness. He had watched the entire 3 hours, frozen in place, unable to intervene, unable to look away. That night, he did not sleep. He sat in the guest room that had been provided to him, staring at the wall, trying to reconcile what he had witnessed with the comfortable narratives he had constructed about his nation. The next morning, Harper requested permission to visit the slave quarters. Colonel Whitfield granted it, assuming that the doctor was interested in studying the medical conditions of the enslaved population. In a sense, this was true, but what Harper was really seeking was understanding. He needed to see these people as people. He needed to know that what he had witnessed was an aberration rather than the norm. What he found instead was worse than he had feared. He saw the scars that covered almost every body. He saw the evidence of malnutrition. He saw the children with distended bellies and the old men crippled by decades of labor without adequate care. He saw the women with haunted eyes and the men with broken spirits. And he saw, standing apart from the others, a woman whose back was a testament to such sustained violence that his medical mind could barely process it. Minerva had not expected to be noticed. When the white doctor approached her, she prepared herself for another examination, another moment of being treated as a specimen rather than a person. She lowered her eyes in the way she had learned to do. She waited for the inspection to be completed. "May I see your back?" Harper asked. His voice was different from what she expected. There was something in it that she had not heard from a white person in over a decade. Something that might have been respect. Minerva turned without speaking. She pulled aside the fabric of her dress, exposing the landscape of her suffering. She heard Harper's sharp intake of breath. She felt his fingers, gentle and professional, tracing the ridges of scar tissue. "How many times?" he asked. "I stopped counting," she replied. "After 100. Silence. Then, "How are you still alive?" "Because dying would have been easy." Harper circled around to face her. He looked into her eyes, and what he saw there made him take a step backward. Not in fear. In recognition. He had seen that same look in the eyes of soldiers returning from war, in the eyes of patients who had survived traumas that should have killed them. It was the look of someone who had passed through fire and emerged as something different, something harder, something that could no longer be destroyed by ordinary means. "What is your name?" he asked. "Minerva." "Minerva." He repeated it as if testing the word. "The goddess of wisdom and strategic warfare." Her eyes flickered with surprise. White people rarely knew classical mythology, and even those who did rarely applied it to enslaved people. "My mother gave it to me," she said, "before they took her." Harper stood in silence for a long moment. The other enslaved people had gathered at a distance, watching this unusual interaction. They had never seen a white man speak to one of them this way. They did not know what to make of it. Finally, Harper spoke again. His voice carried clearly enough that everyone in the vicinity could hear. "I have traveled through many parts of this country. I have met wealthy men and poor men, strong men and weak men, men who consider themselves superior by virtue of their birth or their accomplishments." He paused, looking around at the assembled faces. "But I have never met anyone stronger than this woman. She is stronger than all of us." The words fell into the silence like stones into still water. Ripples spread outward. The other enslaved people exchanged glances. Minerva felt something shift inside her chest, something that she had protected for so long that she had almost forgotten it existed. She had been seen. After 15 years of cultivating invisibility, a stranger had looked at her and recognized what lay beneath the surface. It was terrifying. It was exhilarating. And it changed everything. "Doctor." Harper left the Whitfield plantation 3 days later, his fever broken and his research project abandoned. He would return to Philadelphia and become one of the most vocal abolitionists in the state, using his medical credentials and his eyewitness testimony to sway audiences who had previously been comfortable in their indifference. But that is another story. The story that concerns us is what his words left behind. Stronger than all of us. The phrase spread through the quarters like wildfire through dry brush. It was repeated in whispers. It was incorporated into work songs. It became a coded reference that everyone understood, and no white person could decipher. Minerva, the invisible woman, had been named. Minerva, the broken shell, had been recognized. And in that recognition, something had shifted in the collective consciousness of the enslaved community. People began to approach her again. At first, tentatively, then with increasing boldness. They came to her cabin at night, singly and in pairs, asking questions they had not dared to ask in years. What did she think about the situation in Kansas? Had she heard about John Brown? Was it true that there were places in the North where black people lived free? Did she believe that freedom was possible? Minerva answered their questions. Cautiously at first, testing to see who could be trusted, then more openly, as she began to identify the reliable members of the community. She shared what she knew: the routes north, the safe houses along the way, the network of communication that connected them to the larger world. And she shared something else, something that had been forming in her mind for years. A plan. Grace was her first recruit. The young woman whose spirit had seemed to die after her daughter was taken had been slowly recovering under Minerva's attention. She would never be what she had been before. But she had become something else, something fiercer, something that burned with a cold flame that Crenshaw's violence could not extinguish. Others followed. Samuel, the hamstrung man who had never stopped plotting despite his crippled legs. Old Martha, who had been on the plantation for 40 years and knew its secrets better than anyone living. Jacob, the blacksmith who had access to tools and materials that would be essential. Ruth's partner's brother, who carried the memory of that distant death like a wound that would never heal. They met in the swamp, in a clearing that could only be reached by paths that Minerva had mapped over years of careful exploration. They spoke in voices barely above whispers. They planned. The plan was not escape. The plan was not merely survival. The plan was something that had not been attempted on this scale in Mississippi since the Natchez Rebellion of 1811. The plan was resistance. The plan was destruction. The plan was, in its own way, a declaration of war. They would wait for the right moment. The Christmas holidays, when discipline on the plantation relaxed and the White family would be distracted by celebrations. They would neutralize the overseers first, using methods that Jacob had been preparing for months. Then they would secure weapons from the armory that Colonel Whitfield kept inadequately guarded. Then they would take the great house. And then? Minerva was not certain. Perhaps they would flee north, using the chaos they had created to cover their escape. Perhaps they would stand and fight, knowing that their deaths would inspire others to continue the struggle. Perhaps something she could not yet foresee would present itself. The specifics mattered less than the principle. They would no longer accept their condition. They would resist with everything they had, and whatever happened next would be determined by forces larger than any individual. The preparations continued through the autumn of 1857. Weapons were hidden, routes were memorized, roles were assigned. And through it all, Minerva moved through the plantation like she always had, invisible, unremarkable, a broken woman whose spirit had died years before. But those who knew her now saw something different when they looked at her. They saw the goddess of wisdom and strategic warfare. They saw strength that had been forged in fire and tempered by suffering. They saw a leader. Chapter 9. The Eve of Destruction, December 24th, 1857, Christmas Eve on the Whitfield plantation. The great house blazed with light and music. Colonel Whitfield had invited the neighboring planters to a celebration that would demonstrate his wealth and cement his social position. Carriages lined the drive. The smell of roasting meats drifted across the grounds. Laughter echoed from the ballroom, where couples danced to music provided by enslaved musicians who had been commanded to perform their joy. In the quarters, a different kind of preparation was underway. The conspirators had gathered in Minerva's cabin, speaking in whispers that could not be overheard above the distant sounds of celebration. There were 17 of them now, 17 people who had decided that death in resistance was preferable to life in submission, 17 flames that were about to combine into something much larger. Minerva stood at the center of the group. Her voice was low but steady. Tonight, when the second bell rings to signal the midnight hour, we begin. Samuel will create the diversion at the east end of the quarters, something that will draw Crenshaw and at least one other overseer away from their posts. While they are occupied, Jacob will open the armory. The lock has already been weakened. It will take him less than a minute. She looked around the room, meeting each pair of eyes in turn. Once we have weapons, Grace and her group will secure the back entrance to the great house. The doors there are rarely guarded during celebrations. You know the layout. You know where the family sleeps. You know what must be done. Grace nodded. Her face was set in an expression that showed no fear. I will deal with Crenshaw personally, Minerva continued. He will be drawn to the diversion. He will be drunk by midnight. He will not be expecting what comes for him. Old Martha spoke up. And after? What happens when the sun rises and the patrols come? We have prepared for that. The horses are ready. The routes are mapped. Those who wish to flee can flee. Those who wish to stay and face what comes will stay. Each person must make their own choice when the time comes. The group sat in silence for a moment, the weight of what they were about to attempt settling over them like a shroud. Then Samuel, the hamstrung man who had never stopped fighting despite everything that had been taken from him, spoke. I have waited 8 years for this night. 8 years of dragging myself through the dirt while they laughed. 8 years of watching them destroy everyone I loved. His voice cracked with emotion. Whatever happens, I am ready. I would rather die standing than live another day on my knees. One by one, the others echoed his sentiment. Their voices wove together into something that was almost a prayer, a communion of the condemned, a shared commitment to whatever lay ahead. Minerva listened without speaking. When the last voice had fallen silent, she reached into the folds of her dress and withdrew a piece of cloth. It was old and faded, barely recognizable as the fragment of a baby's blanket that it had once been. She had kept it for 18 years, since the day they had taken her daughter. "This is all I have left of her," she said. "I do not know where she is. I do not know if she is alive, but I know that she would want me to fight. I know that every child they have taken from every mother on this plantation would want us to fight. Tonight, we fight for them. Tonight, we fight for ourselves. Tonight, we become what they have always feared we might become." She tucked the cloth back into her dress and straightened her shoulders. "Go now. Rest if you can. Pray if you believe in prayer. And when the second bell rings, remember who you are. Remember what they have done. Remember what we are about to do." The conspirators dispersed into the darkness, each returning to their assigned positions. The great house continued to glow with light and echo with music. The overseers continued their rounds, unaware that their world was about to end. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to the drama unfolding beneath them. And Minerva sat alone in her cabin, running her fingers over the scars that covered her back, counting the hours until midnight. The second bell rang at midnight, its tone cutting through the cold December air like a blade. In the great house, the guests raised their glasses for a toast to the holiday. In the quarters, 17 people moved through the darkness with purpose. The diversion went exactly as planned. Samuel had positioned himself near the barn where the mules were kept. He had concealed a torch in the hay days earlier. Now he struck flint to steel, touched flame to straw, and watched as the fire began to spread. The mules screamed, the smoke rose, and across the plantation voices began to shout. Silas Crenshaw was drunk as Minerva had predicted, but not so drunk that he failed to respond to the alarm. He staggered from the small house where he lived, cursing and shouting orders, and headed toward the source of the commotion. 2 of the other overseers followed him. The fourth, a young man named Peters, who had only been on the plantation for 6 months, remained at his post near the armory. Jacob approached Peters with the shuffling gait that enslaved people used when dealing with their overseers. Submissive, non-threatening. He asked about the fire. Was it serious? Should they help? Peters turned to answer, and in that moment of distraction, Jacob's hands found his throat. The struggle was brief. Peters was young and strong, but Jacob had spent 20 years working the forge. His grip was iron. When the overseer's body went limp, Jacob lowered him gently to the ground and checked for breath. There was none. He had killed a white man. There was no going back now. The armory lock gave way easily, just as Minerva had promised. Inside were 20 muskets, a dozen pistols, powder and shot enough for a small war. Jacob began passing weapons through the door to the men who had gathered outside. Their hands trembled as they received them. Most had never fired a gun in their lives, but they had watched. They had learned, and fear was a powerful teacher. Grace and her group were already at the back entrance of the great house. The door was unlocked as expected. They slipped inside, moving through the servants' corridors that they knew better than any white person who had ever lived there. They could hear the music from the ballroom, the laughter, the clink of crystal, sounds that seemed to come from another world entirely. Their targets were specific, not the guests, not the musicians, not the house servants who had no part in this. Their targets were Colonel Whitfield and his immediate family, the architects of the system that had oppressed them, the beneficiaries of their suffering, the people whose deaths would send a message that could not be ignored. Meanwhile, Minerva tracked Crenshaw through the darkness. She followed the sound of his voice, his cursing, his drunken stumbling. He had reached the barn fire and was attempting to organize the efforts to contain it. Buckets of water were being passed from hand to hand. The mules had been cut loose and were running in panicked circles. The chaos was perfect. She approached him from behind. She moved without sound, the years of making herself invisible finally serving the purpose she had always intended. In her hand was a blade that Jacob had forged specifically for this moment. Curved, sharp, designed for a single purpose. Crenshaw never heard her coming, never knew that his death had arrived until the blade opened his throat from ear to ear. He fell without a cry, his blood black in the firelight. Minerva stood over him, watching the life drain from his eyes. "For my daughter," she said, "for Grace's daughter, for everyone you ever touched. May your God have mercy on your soul, because I have none." Gunshots echoed from the direction of the great house. Screams, breaking glass. The plan was unfolding as it had been designed. The celebration had become a battlefield. Minerva turned toward the sound, leaving Crenshaw's body in the mud. There was more work to be done. The chaos inside the great house was complete. The armed men and women of the rebellion had burst into the ballroom, their weapons raised, their faces masks of determination. The guests scattered. Women screamed. Men reached for weapons they did not have, their swords and pistols left in the cloakroom as social convention demanded. Colonel Whitfield tried to resist. He lunged for a serving knife on the nearest table. Jacob's musket ball took him in the chest before his fingers could close around the handle. He fell backward into his wife's arms, his blood staining her white silk gown. Caroline Whitfield did not scream. She looked down at her dying husband, then up at the people who had killed him, and in her eyes was something unexpected. Recognition. As if some part of her had always known this moment would come. As if the luxury she had enjoyed for so many years had never quite erased the awareness of its cost. She died beside her husband, dispatched by a blow from old Martha, who had served her for 30 years. "I cleaned your floors," Martha said. "I washed your clothes. I nursed your children when they were sick, and you never once said my name." The battle was brief, but bloody. 3 of the conspirators fell, cut down by a guest who had managed to retrieve a pistol. Half a dozen white people died, including the Whitfield children, whose ages ranged from 12 to 23. The survivors fled into the night, carrying tales that would spread across Mississippi like wildfire. When it was over, Minerva stood in the center of the ballroom, surrounded by bodies and broken glass. The crystal chandeliers still blazed overhead, their light now illuminating a scene of carnage rather than celebration. The musicians had fled or died. The guests were gone. The great house, symbol of everything that had oppressed them, was theirs. "Burn it," she said. "All of it. Leave nothing but ashes." They set the fires deliberately, methodically. The library, with its books that had justified their enslavement with scripture and pseudoscience. The bedrooms where the family had slept in comfort purchased with suffering. The kitchen, where their labor had been transformed into delicacies they were forbidden to taste. Room by room, floor by floor, the Whitfield plantation burned. As the flames rose higher, Minerva moved through the quarters, gathering those who had not been part of the conspiracy. Families with children too young to run, old people who had accepted their fate years ago, the sick, the frightened, the uncertain. She told them what had happened. She told them what was coming, and she gave them a choice. "The roads are open," she said. "The patrols will not be organized until morning. Those who wish to try for the north can go now. I have maps. I have contacts. I can give you what help I can. Those who wish to stay must understand that the army will come. They will not show mercy. Whatever you decide, decide quickly." Some chose to run. 63 people fled into the night, following routes that Minerva had mapped over years of patient observation. They scattered in small groups, heading for safe houses that might or might not still be safe, trusting in luck and desperation and the network that connected them to freedom. Others chose to stay. The old, the sick, those who were too tired to run, and a small group of fighters who had decided that their last stand would be here, on the ground where they had suffered, on the ashes of the house that had imprisoned them. Minerva stayed. As the great house collapsed into flame, she stood watching with an expression that those around her could not read. Was it satisfaction? Grief? Relief? Perhaps it was all of these things. Perhaps it was none of them. Perhaps it was simply the look of someone who had completed a task that had consumed their entire adult life. "What now?" Grace asked, standing beside her. "Now we wait," Minerva replied. "The sun will rise, the patrols will come, the militia will follow, and we will meet them. We will show them that we are not what they believed us to be. We will show them what free people can do." The news traveled faster than any messenger could carry it. By dawn, every plantation within 50 miles knew that the Whitfields were dead. By noon, the governor had been informed. By nightfall, militia units were mobilizing across Mississippi. But something else was traveling alongside the news, something that the authorities had not anticipated. Hope. The enslaved people of Mississippi had been living under a terror so complete that resistance had seemed unimaginable. They had been taught that rebellion was impossible, that the white population was too powerful, too numerous, too well armed to be challenged, that the only options were submission or death. And then came word of the Whitfield plantation, word of 17 people who had risen up and destroyed their oppressors, word of a woman named Minerva who had been called stronger than all of them, word that changed everything. On December 26th, an overseer on the Chambers plantation was found dead, his skull crushed by a farm implement. The killer was never identified. On December 27th, the cotton gin at the Harrison place burned to the ground. 3 enslaved people escaped in the confusion and were never recaptured. On December 28th, a group of field hands on the Maxwell estate refused to work. They stood in the fields with arms crossed, waiting for the whipping that they knew would come. But when the overseer raised his lash, he found himself facing not beaten servants, but human beings who had decided they would not be beaten again. He rode away to fetch help. By the time he returned, the entire enslaved population of the plantation had vanished into the swamp. The rebellion spread like fire in dry brush, not as a coordinated uprising, but as 1,000 individual acts of resistance, inspired by the knowledge that others had acted first. The system that had seemed so permanent, so unshakable, suddenly revealed itself to be far more fragile than anyone had imagined. Letters flew between plantation owners filled with alarm and barely concealed panic. "The Negroes are in a state of excitement," one wrote. "They speak of Minerva as if she were a general. They call her method the Whitfield way. Something must be done immediately, or we will all be murdered in our beds." The militia responded with overwhelming force. Patrols were tripled, curfews were imposed. Any gathering of more than 3 enslaved people was automatically suspect. Whippings increased, executions became public, designed to terrorize the population back into submission. But the fear had cut both ways. The white population of Mississippi was now confronted with a reality they had always known, but had carefully avoided acknowledging. They were surrounded by people who had every reason to hate them. They slept in houses built by people who might, at any moment, decide that the cost of obedience was higher than the cost of resistance. The fantasy of contented servants and grateful laborers was shattered forever, and at the center of this spreading chaos was a woman who had been invisible until a stranger called her the strongest person he had ever met. The militia arrived at the ruins of the Whitfield plantation on the morning of December 29, 1857. 300 men, armed and mounted, determined to make an example that would end the rebellion before it could spread further. They expected to find a small group of exhausted survivors, easy to overwhelm and easier to execute. They found something else. Minerva had used the time well. The remaining fighters had fortified their position in the stone buildings near the cotton gin, the only structures that had not been consumed by the fire. They had collected weapons from the fallen. They had prepared barricades. They had transformed themselves from escaped slaves into soldiers. There were only 14 of them left. Samuel, despite his crippled legs, had positioned himself at a window with a musket, his hands steady despite everything. Grace stood beside Minerva, her fear transformed into something harder and more dangerous. Jacob, old Martha, and the others had taken their positions, each one prepared to sell their life as dearly as possible. The militia commander, a man named Colonel Rutherford, rode forward under a flag of truce. He shouted across the distance, offering terms. Surrender, and they would receive a fair trial. Their lives would be spared, perhaps even their freedom. If they would name the other conspirators, identify the safe houses, reveal the network. Minerva stepped forward to respond. Her voice carried clearly in the morning air. You offer us trials? You whose courts have declared that we have no rights? You whose laws make it legal to steal our children, to violate our bodies, to work us to death for your profit? What trial could you offer that would be fair? Rutherford shifted in his saddle. You have murdered white citizens. You have burned property. The law demands justice. Justice? Minerva laughed, and the sound was terrible. Silas Crenshaw beat me more than 100 times. He killed my daughter's spirit before he killed her body. He destroyed men and women for his pleasure. Was that not murder? Was there no law that demanded justice for us? No response from the militia. Only the restless shifting of horses and the muttered comments of men who were beginning to understand that they were not facing animals or monsters, but people. People who could speak. People who could reason. People who had decided that death was preferable to the lives they had been forced to lead. We will not surrender, Minerva continued. We will not name others. We will not help you hunt down those who have escaped. If you want us, come and take us. We are ready to die. Are you ready to pay the price? The flag of truce was withdrawn. Colonel Rutherford gave the order to advance. The battle lasted 3 hours. 300 militia against 14 former slaves, and the outcome was never in doubt. But the cost was higher than anyone had expected. 37 militiamen died. 60 more were wounded. The stone buildings had to be taken room by room, each defender fighting until their ammunition was exhausted, and then continuing with knives and bare hands. Samuel fell first, still firing from his window, still refusing to retreat. Old Martha died defending the door to the main building, taking 2 men with her before a bayonet ended her resistance. Grace fell beside Minerva, their hands clasped together even in death. In the end, only Minerva remained. She had retreated to a small storage room, barricading the door with whatever she could find. Her ammunition was gone. Her strength was nearly exhausted. Through a crack in the wall, she could see the militia preparing their final assault. She reached into her dress and withdrew the fragment of baby blanket she had carried for 18 years. She pressed it to her lips, whispering words that no one else could hear. A prayer, perhaps. A goodbye. A message to a daughter she would never see. When they broke down the door, they found her waiting. She had positioned herself against the far wall, her hands empty, her chin raised. The soldier who entered first hesitated, struck by something in her bearing that made him reluctant to raise his weapon. She's stronger than all of us, he said later, quoting words he did not know had come from a northern doctor. Even at the end, even with everything, there was something in her eyes that... He never finished the sentence. He never needed to. Those who heard him understood. Minerva died on December 29, 1857. She was 43 years old. She had been enslaved for 37 years. She had been invisible for most of them. And in the end, she had been seen. They buried her in an unmarked grave, as they buried all slaves who rose against their masters. They burned the records of her existence. They forbade the speaking of her name. They did everything possible to erase her from history. They failed. The story of Minerva spread through the slave quarters of the South like a gospel. It was whispered in the fields and sung in the spirituals. It was carried along the Underground Railroad and preached in northern churches. It became a symbol of resistance, proof that the human spirit could not be permanently broken, no matter how thoroughly the body was enslaved. Those who escaped from the Whitfield plantation during the uprising scattered across the country. Some made it to Canada. Some settled in free black communities in the North. Some were recaptured and returned to bondage, but all of them carried the story with them. All of them passed it down to their children and their children's children. The fragment of baby blanket was recovered from Minerva's body by a soldier who had been moved by her final moments. He kept it for years, troubled by what he had witnessed, uncertain what to do with the artifact. Eventually, he gave it to a northern journalist who was writing about the rebellion. That journalist donated it to a museum in Philadelphia, where it remains to this day, a small piece of faded cloth that carries the weight of an entire life. The Whitfield plantation never recovered. The land was sold at auction, divided among smaller farmers. transformed beyond recognition. Today the site is a soybean field. Nothing remains of the great house, the cotton gin, the quarters where 347 people suffered and dreamed and occasionally hoped. Only the land remembers. And perhaps the land is enough. Every year, on December 25th, a group of descendants gathers at the site. They come from across the country, carrying photographs and documents that trace their lineage back to the people who rose up on that Christmas Eve so long ago. They stand in the field where the great house once stood, and they speak Minerva's name aloud. They tell her story to their children. They ensure that the erasure the slaveholders attempted will never be complete. Dr. Benjamin Harper, the man who called her stronger than all of us, spent the remaining years of his life as an abolitionist. He died in 1878, having lived to see slavery abolished and the Constitution amended. His final words, according to his daughter, were about Minerva. "I only met her once," he said, "but I have never forgotten her face. I have never forgotten what she showed me about the possibilities of the human spirit." The scholarly debate continues. Some historians question the details of the rebellion, arguing that the records are too fragmentary to support definitive conclusions. Others point to the overwhelming documentary evidence, the letters and newspaper accounts and military reports that confirm the basic outlines of what happened. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in the complexity. But what cannot be debated is the impact. The Whitfield Rebellion, as it came to be known, was one of the largest slave uprisings in American history. It contributed to the rising tensions that would eventually explode into civil war. It demonstrated that the enslaved population would not accept their condition passively. It proved that resistance was possible, even against overwhelming odds. And at the center of it all was a woman who spent 15 years being invisible, who endured more violence than most human beings could survive, who waited and watched and planned with a patience that seems almost superhuman in retrospect, who, when the moment came, led her people in a strike against their oppressors that would echo through generations. Minerva, named for the goddess of wisdom and strategic warfare, called stronger than all of us by a man who barely knew her, remembered by those whose lives she changed forever. Her story is not comfortable. It does not offer easy lessons or simple morals. It reminds us of the capacity of human beings for cruelty and the capacity of human beings for resistance. It shows us what happens when people are pushed beyond the limits of endurance. It asks us to consider what we would do, how we would respond, what we would be willing to sacrifice for freedom. If you watched until here, it's because you care about these stories that marked our country forever. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until here," so I can know who really cares about the search for historical truth. Like this video if Minerva's story touched your heart. Share so that Minerva's memory is never forgotten. The scars on her back told a story of suffering. The fire in her eyes told a story of survival. And the legacy she left behind tells a story that will never end. This was Minerva. This was her truth. This was the woman they tried to make invisible. They failed.